Hello and welcome to my 2021 wrap-up. I read 102 books in 2021. So what I want to do for today's video is tell you all the books I read, what I rated them, and read you a quote that I enjoyed from the book. Or if it's not a quote that I enjoyed, just a quote that I thought was representative of the book. So that is my plan for today. We're going to get right into it because there's 102 books to go. Okay, so the first book that I read this year was Wild by Cheryl Strayed. This was easily a 5-star review for me. It is a memoir written by Cheryl Strayed. What if I was sorry, but if I could go back in time, I wouldn't do anything differently than I had done? What if I was never redeemed? What if I already was? The next book I read this month is The Whisper Man by Alex North. I gave this one 4 stars and it's categorized as a thriller. And here's a quote from this book. If you leave a door half open, soon you'll hear the whispers spoken. If you play outside alone, soon you will be going home. If your window's left unlatched, you'll hear him tapping at the glass. If you're lonely, sad, and blue, the Whisper Man will come for you. The next book I read this month is The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. I rated this one 4 stars and is categorized as a mystery. Here's a quote from the book. I was crying for all of us. There's so much pain everywhere, and we just close our eyes to it. The next book I read this month is Into the Wild by Jon Crocker. This is a non-fiction book, and I rated it as 1 star. That's what's great about him. He tried. Not many do. The 5th book I read this month is A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. This is categorized as a non-fiction book, and I rated it 3 stars. So one quote from Bill Bryson is, "Distance changes considerably when you take the world on foot." The next book I read this month is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. This is the first book in the Dark Tower series, classified as a fantasy book, and I rated it 4 stars. Here's a quote. I do not kill with my gun. He who kills with his gun has forgotten the face of his father. I kill with my heart. The next book I read this month is The Drawing of the Three. This is the second book in the Dark Tower series, immediately following The Gunslinger. This one I rated 5 stars, and it is also categorized as a fantasy book. Here's a quote from this one. We are going to fight. We are going to be hurt. And in the end, we will stand. The 8th book I read this month is Circe by Madeline Miller. This is categorized as a mythology fantasy book, and I rated it 3 stars. Here's a quote. Humbling women seems to be a chief pastime of poets, as if there can be no story unless we crawl and weep. The 9th book I read this once is called Fool Me Once by Harlan Coben. This is categorized as a mystery, and it is rated as 3 stars. They all played, and they all laughed, and they all felt so damn safe. They didn't see how fragile it all was. The 10th book I read this month is The Wastelands by Stephen King. This is the 3rd one in the Dark Tower series, and I rated it 5 stars, and it is categorized as a fantasy book. The mild, spicy smell of old books hit him, and the smell was somehow like coming home. The next book I read this year is Educated by Tara Westover. This is categorized as a non-fiction autobiography book, and I rated it 3 stars. You can miss a person every day and still be glad they are no longer in your life. The next book I read this month was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. I rated this book 4 stars, and it is just categorized as a fiction book. Here's a quote from it. There are some people who can live without wild things, and some who cannot. The next book I read this month was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I rated this book 4 stars. I think it's actually a 5-star book. And it's categorized as a fantasy book. So my favorite quote from this is actually the start of the walking song, which you will see again later in this video. And it goes, roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet the wandering have gone, turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known. The next book I read this year was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is a classic, and I rated it as 3 stars. I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool. The next book I finished this month is A Promised Land by Barack Obama. This is I rated this as 3 stars, and it is a non-fiction book. Whatever you do won't be enough, I heard their voices say. Try anyway. The 16th book I read this month is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is categorized as a mythology/historical fiction book, and I rated it 3 stars. I would know him blind by the way his breath came and his feet struck the earth. I would know him in death at the end of the world. The next book I read this month is The Alice Network by Kate Quinn. This is categorized as a historical fiction, and I rated it 4 stars. What did it matter if something scared you, when it simply had to be done? The next book I read is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is categorized as a historical fiction, and I rated it 4 stars. And a quote from this book, it's a good one. It says, "Don't ignore half of me so you can fit me into a box." The next book I read this month is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is a fantasy book, and I rated it 4 stars. Here's the continuation of the walking song. The road goes ever on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, and where many paths and errands meet, and whither then, I cannot say. The next book I read this year was Misery by Stephen King. This is a horror book, and I rated it 3 stars. And a quote from it says, "Art consists of the persistence of memory." The next book I read this year is The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry by Rachel Joyce. I rated this one 4 stars, and it's categorized as a fiction book. A quote from this book says, "A life might appear ordinary, simply because the person living it had been doing so for a long time." The next book I read this year is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This is a horror book, and I rated it 4 stars. And a quote from this book says, "Sometimes dead is better." The next book I read this month is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This is categorized as a fantasy book, and I rated it 5 stars. We should always make time for the things we like. If we don't, we might forget how to be happy. The next book I read this month is Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. This is categorized as a mystery, and I rated it 1 star. The face you'll give the world tells the world how to treat you. The next book I read this year was The Outsider by Stephen King. This is categorized as a horror, and I rated it 5 stars. Reality is thin ice, but most people skate on it their entire lives and never fall through until the very end. The next book I finished this year was The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, the second book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and it is categorized as a fantasy book. I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I only love what they defend. The next book I finished this month was Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King. This is categorized as a fictional thriller, and I rated it 5 stars. Life is a crap carnival with shit prizes. The next book I read this month is The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. This one I rated 4 stars, and it is categorized as a mystery thriller. After all, everyone's entitled to be the hero of their own story. So I must be permitted to be the hero of mine, even though I'm not. I'm the villain. The next book I read this year is Anxious People by Fredrik Backman, and this is categorized as a fiction, and I rated it 4 stars. The truth, of course, is that if people really were as happy as they look on the internet, they wouldn't spend so much damn time on the internet, because no one who's having a really good time spends half of it taking pictures of themselves. The next book is 3 Wishes by Liane Moriarty. This one is categorized as a fiction, and I rated it 3 stars. Death was the hot bath you promised yourself while you endured small talk and uncomfortable shoes. The next book. So the next book is Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman. This is categorized as a fiction, and I rated it 1 star. We had the stars, you and I, and this is given only once. The next book I finished this year was Carrie by Stephen King. This is categorized as a horror book, and I gave it 3 stars. People don't get better, they just get smarter. When you get smarter, you don't stop pulling the wings off flies. You just think of better reasons for doing it. The next book I finished this year is Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is a romance book, and I rated it 4 stars. So I'm doing it for you because that's how people should behave. They should fill in each other's gaps. The next book I finished this year is the first part of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. This is categorized as a science fiction book, and I rated it 4 stars. Don't panic. The 35th book I finished this year is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. This is a self-help book, and I rated it 2 stars. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. The next book I finished this year was Mastery by Robert Greene. This is categorized as a nonfiction, and I rated it 2 stars. The future belongs to those who learn more skills and combine them in creative ways. The next book I read this year was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and this is a fantasy book, and I rated it 3 stars. The finest of pleasures are always the unexpected ones. The next book I read this year was American Sniper by Chris Kyle. This is categorized as a nonfiction book, and I rated it 4 stars. My regrets are about the people I couldn't save. Marines, soldiers, my buddies. I still feel their loss. I still ache for my failure to protect them. The next book I finished this year was The Shining by Stephen King. This was a reread. It is a horror book, and I rated it 5 stars. Sometimes human places create inhuman monsters. The next book I finished this year was Lone Survivor by Marcus Luttrell, one of my favorite books of the year. This is categorized as a non-fiction book, and I rated it 5 stars. I will never quit. My nation expects me to be physically harder and mentally stronger than my enemies. If I get knocked down, I will get back up every time. That was one quote, and another. The politicians have chosen to send us into battle, and that's our trade. We do what's necessary. And in my view, once those politicians have elected to send us out to do what 99.9% of the country would be terrified to undertake, they should get the hell out of the way and stay there. The next book I read this year was the second book in the series of 5, from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Also a science fiction book, also rated 4 stars, and it's called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. And a quote from it goes, "The story so far. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move." The next book I read this year was The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. This is a non-fiction book, and I rated it 2 stars. The tipping point is that magic moment when an idea, trend, or social behavior crosses a threshold, tips, and spreads like wildfire. The next book I read this year was The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon by Stephen King. This is a horror book, and I rated it 5 stars. The world had teeth, and it could bite you with them anytime it wanted. The next book I read this year was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a fiction/historical fiction book, and I rated it 4 stars. How are you supposed to change in ways both big and small when your family was always there to remind you of exactly the person you apparently signed an ironclad contract to be? The next book I read this year was Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This is a non-fiction book, and I rated it 1 star. Our comforting conviction that the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. The next book I read this year was Dreams for My Father by Barack Obama. That is a non-fiction book that I rated as 3 stars. The worst thing colonialism did was to cloud our view of our past. The next book I read last year was Dr. Sleep by Stephen King. This is a horror book that I rated as 5 stars. Life was a wheel, its only job was to turn, and it always came back to where it started. The next book I read this year was one of my favorites. It's called The Choice by Dr. Edith Eger. It is a non-fiction book that I rated 5 stars, and I have 3 quotes from it. "We don't know where we're going, we don't know what's going to happen, but no one can take away from you what you put in your mind. To forgive is to grieve for what happened for what didn't happen, and to give up for the need for a different past." And the last one, "The only place we can exercise our freedom of choice is in the present." The 45th book I read this year is A Dog's Journey by W. Bruce Cameron. This is a fictional book that I rated 5 stars. You can usually tell that a man is good if he has a good dog who loves him. The next book I finished this year was Bossy Pants by Tina Fey. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 3 stars. Some people say never let them see you cry. I say if you're so mad you could just cry, then cry. It terrifies everyone. The next book I read this year was A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 5 stars. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms. To choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. To choose one's own way. The next book that I read this year is The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo by Amy Schumer. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 4 stars. I know my worth. I embrace my power. I say if I'm beautiful. I say if I'm strong. You will not determine my story. I will. I'll speak and share and fuck and love, and I will never apologize for it. The next book that I read this year is The Happiest Man on Earth by Eddie Jaku. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 5 stars. And here's a quote. "Here's what I learned. Happiness does not fall from the sky. It is in your hands. Happiness comes from inside yourself and from the people you love. If you are happy and healthy, you are a millionaire. The next book that I read this year was Finders Keepers by Stephen King. That is categorized as a thriller, and I gave it 4 stars. A good novelist does not lead his characters, he follows them. A good novelist does not create events, he watches them and writes down what he sees. The next book I read this year is Night by Elie Wiesel. It is a non-fiction book that I rated 3 stars. Human suffering anywhere concerns men and women everywhere. The next book I read this year was Playing Nice by J.P. Delaney. I rated this book 5 stars and it's categorized as a thriller. It says, love your job, but don't expect it to love you back. The next book I read this year was Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King. This is a horror and I rated it 4 stars. Sometimes you have to be a high-riding bitch to survive. Sometimes being a bitch is all a woman has to hang on to. The next book I read this year was My Own Words by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. This is a collection of essays, which was not what I was expecting. It is categorized as a non-fiction book, and it is rated 3 stars. When a thoughtless or unkind word is spoken, best tune out. Reacting in anger or annoyance will not advance one's ability to persuade. The next book I read this year was The Shadows by Alex North. This is a horror, and I rated it 3 stars. If you've watched my worst books of the year, this one's on it. But everything is okay until it isn't. People are there, large as life, and taken for granted, and then they aren't. The next book, the 60th book I read this year, was The Answer Is by Alex Trebek. This is a non-fiction book that I rated as 4 stars. Don't worry about it. Just look ahead to the next question. You didn't get here by accident. You passed the test. You deserve to be here. The next book that I finished this year is End of Watch by Stephen King, the final book in the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, and it is a horror book that I rated 5 stars. Because things can get better, and if you give them the chance, they usually do. The next book I finished this year is The Return of the King, the last book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This is a fantasy book that I rated 4 stars, and this is the end of the walking song. The road goes ever on and on, out to the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone. Let others follow if they can. Let them a journey new begin. But I at last with weary feet will turn towards the lighted inn, my evening rest and sleep to meet. The next book I finished this year is The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 5 stars and was a reread for me. It says, I lived in a world that at any moment could erupt into flames. It was the sort of knowledge that kept you on your toes. The next book I read this year was Billy Summers by Stephen King, his newest book. This was a 5-star read from me, and it is a thriller. You can't help how you feel. Feelings are like breathing. They come in and go out. The next book I read this year was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This was a 3-star read from me, and it is a classic/fiction book. Stuff your eyes with wonder, he said. Live as if you dropped dead in 10 seconds. See the world. It's more fantastic than any dream made or paid for in any factories. The next book I read this year was The Audacity of Hope by Barack Obama. This was a 3-star read for me, and it is a non-fiction book. A nation that can't control its energy sources can't control its future. The next book I read this year was Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. This book is a non-fiction book that I rated 4 stars. The key to good decision making is not knowledge, it is understanding. We are swimming in the former, we are desperately lacking in the latter. The next book I read this year is If It Bleeds by Stephen King. This is a collection of short stories and it is categorized as a horror. I rated it 4 stars. When an old man dies, the library burns. The 69th book I read this year is The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. This is a fiction mystery book and I rated it 5 stars. Sometimes the dreams that come true are the dreams you never even knew you had. The next book I read this year is What Happened by Hillary Rodham Clinton. One of the greatest surprises of this year, I would say. I rated this one as 4 stars, and it is a non-fiction book. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. And I have another quote. Sexism is all the big and little ways that society draws a box around women and says, you stay in there. The next book I read this year is The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. This is a non-fiction book, and I did not rate it. People can tell you to keep your mouth shut, but that doesn't stop you from having your own opinion. The next book I read this month was It by Stephen King. This is a classic horror novel, and I rated it 5 stars. What can be done when you're 11 can often never be done again. And another one, We all float down here. The next book I read is The Twins of Auschwitz by Eva Moses Kor. This is a non-fiction book. I concentrated all my being on one thing: how to survive one more day in this horrible place. The next book I read was Three Sisters by Heather Morris. This is a historical book and I rated it 5 stars. We shouldn't look at each day as a series of tasks we have to get through, but to see each 24 hours as a gift from God and cherish individual moments. The next book I read this year was Letter to My Daughter by Maya Angelou. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 3 stars. I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. The next book I read this year is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This is a classic, and I rated it 3 stars. Suffering has been stronger than all other teaching, and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I have been bent and broken, but, I hope, into a better shape. The next book I read this year is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. It is a horror novel, and I rated it 4 stars. God grant me to serenity to accept what I cannot change, the tenacity to change what I may, and the good luck to not fuck up too often. The next book I finished this year is The Guest List by Lucy Foley. This is a mystery book that I rated 3 stars. And I'm not worried about it being haunted. I have my own ghosts. I carry them with me wherever I go. The next book I finished this year is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 4 stars. You could never convince a monkey to give you a banana by promising him limitless bananas after death in monkey heaven. The next book I read this year is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is a classic and I rated it 3 stars. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. The next book I read this year is Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is another classic and I rated it 3 stars. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The next book I read this year is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This is a non-fiction book that I did not rate. And a quote from it says, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." The next book I read this year is Beartown by Frederick Bachman. This is classified as a contemporary, which I don't really know what that means, but I rated it 5 stars. And I have 3 quotes from it. For the perpetrator, rape lasts just a matter of minutes. For the victim, it never stops. When enough people are quiet for long enough, a handful of voices can give the impression that everyone is screaming. Hockey is just a silly little game. We devote year after year after year to it without ever really hoping to get anything in return. We burn and we bleed and cry, fully aware that the most the sport can give us, in the very best scenario, is incomprehensibly meager and worthless. Just a few isolated moments of transcendence. That's all. What the hell else is life made of? The next book I finished this year is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. This is a fictional book that I rated 2 stars. The most loving parents and relatives commit murder with smiles on their face. They force us to destroy the person we really are, a subtle kind of murder. The next book I finished this year is Hard Choices by Hillary Rodham Clinton. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 3 stars. And in it she says, "Along the way I've tried to learn not to make the same mistake twice. To learn, to adapt, and to pray for the wisdom to make better choices in the future." The next book I read this year is Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson. This is a science book, and I rated it 4 stars. And a quote from it, which is very good, says, "The universe is under no obligation to make sense to you." The next book I read this year is Us Against You by Frederick Bachman. This is the 2nd book in the Beartown series. The 3rd one is not out yet, and I rated it 5 stars. The complicated thing about good and bad people alike is that most of us can be both at the same time. And another quote, "Culture isn't just what we encourage, but what we allow to happen." And the next book I read this year is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This is a fictional book that I rated 4 stars. It is easy to mourn the lives we aren't living. The next book I read this year is Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay. This is a non-fictional book that I did not rate. In it she says, "I believe feminism is grounded in supporting the choices of women, even if we wouldn't make certain choices for ourselves." The next book I finished this year is Atomic Habits by James Clear. This is a self-help book that I rated 3 stars. In it he says, "You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems." The next book I finished this year is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I rated this one 3 stars, and it is a classic book. There is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. The next book I finished this year is Elevation by Stephen King. This is a fiction book, and I rated it 3 stars. He thought he discovered one of life's great truths. The only thing harder than saying goodbye to yourself, a pound at a time, was saying goodbye to your friends. The next book I read this year is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a classic, and I rated it 2 stars. I was still cursed with my duality of purpose. The next book I finished this year was Wizard and Glass by Stephen King, also in the Dark Tower series, and I rated this one 4 stars. It is a fantasy book, and in it he says, "If it's caught, it'll come like a wind, and your plans will stand before it, no more than a barn before a cyclone." The next book I finished this year is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. This is a non-fiction book that I did not rate. In it he says, "We tell people to follow their dreams, but you can only dream of what you can imagine, and depending on where you come from, your imagination can be quite limited." The next book I finished this year was Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 4 stars. In it he says, "People are usually afraid of change because they fear the unknown. But the single greatest constant of history is that everything changes." The next book I read this month was In a Holidays by Christina Lauren. This is a romance, and I rated it 3 stars. In it she says, or they say, "I've essentially handed my heart over to the person who's had it on reserve for half my life, and I'm terrified that he doesn't realize what he's holding." The 98th book that I read this year, and my favorite one, is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a non-fictional book that I rated 5 stars. In it she says, "I am a victim. I have no qualms with this word, only with the idea that that is all that I am." Another quote, "My pain was never more valuable than his potential." And one last quote, "When a woman is assaulted, one of the first questions people ask is, 'Did you say no?' This question assumes that the answer was always yes, and that it is her job to revoke the agreement, to defuse the bomb she was given. But why are they allowed to touch us until we physically fight them off?" The 99th book I read this year is Things My Son Needs to Know About the World by Frederick Bachman. This is a non-fiction book that I rated 3 stars. I want you to always remember that you can become whatever you want to become, but that's nowhere near as important as knowing that you can be exactly who you are. The next book I read this year is Wind Through the Keyhole by Stephen King. This is the 5th book in the Dark Tower series, and I rated it 4 stars. In the end, the wind takes everything, doesn't it? And why not? Why other? If the sweetness of our lives did not depart, there would be no sweetness at all. The 101st book I read this year is rated by Bob Woodward, and I rated it 3 stars. He's the kind of person that could inspire crazy people. And the final book I read this year is The Green Mile by Stephen King, and I rated it 5 stars, and it is classified as a horror book, which I don't agree with. It's not that scary. In it he says, "Sometimes there is no difference at all between salvation and damnation." So those are the 102 books I read this year. I apologize if the audio probably isn't great because I can't enunciate. That's all for now. Bye.